Chapter 4: Responding to the Ethical and Social Environment. The learning objectives for this chapter will include an understanding of managerial ethics, and this will include learning on the ethical concern for managers and how organizations manage ethical behavior. Also, look at the emerging ethical issues in organizations, as well as the concept of social responsibility and whom organizations are responsible to, which would include the stakeholders of organizations, as well as what an organization or what actions that may be taken by an organization for such organization to be considered responsible. We'll also be looking at the types of organizational approaches to social responsibility. Further on the learning objectives, we'll be exploring the relationship between government and organizations with respect to social responsibility, as well as looking at the actions organizations engage in order to manage social responsibility. Individual ethics in organizations. Ethics is one's personal beliefs about whether a behavior or an action or a decision is wrong or right. And you find out that individuals that form the human resource of organizations have ethics, and these ethics may vary from one employee to another. And individuals are the ones who actually have ethics, not organizations. You find out that as against individuals having ethics, organizations would basically have norms, all right, or what you have like the culture or maybe policies and procedures that guide organizational behavior. Now you have the ethical behavior. Ethical behavior would be the behavior that conforms to the generally accepted norms. And you find out that unethical behavior would basically be those behaviors that do not conform to laid down norms that are basically within the organization. And such norms may be contained in the student handbooks, like in a place like Francis Marion University. New students are given handbooks, right? And those handbooks are basically containing information that relay what the norms are within the environment of Francis Marion University as an organization. So also for new faculty have an understanding that the faculty handbook is available on the university's website. So that would also be where information is contained regarding what behavior is considered ethical in or what norms are instituted in the Francis Marion environment. Now, further on ethics, you find out that these individual ethics or ethics for employees or individuals within an organization that they arise from the individual's foundation or what you call the background or the individual's experience, religious obligation, the laws that guide the environment in which the individual finds themselves, or the culture of such an organization like Francis Marion University, as we've said, right? So, the ethics that people develop or what guides their values or their beliefs will basically be aligned with what is obtainable in the environment that they are in as well, right? So, also, you have examples further down the slide that you can look at to enlighten you more on ethics. Managerial ethics. These are standards for behavior that guide individual managers in their work within organizations. And you find out that it's expected that managers approach each set of relationships from an ethical and moral perspective. And why the expectation is for them to do this from an ethical perspective is, if you recall, managers are individuals, they're employees of an organization, right? So they should have ethical beliefs, and it's expected that such ethical beliefs should be aligned with moral justifications as well. And if you look at this diagram on this slide, you'll find out that it's basically expressing or relaying what the relationship is like, or the ethical obligations is like between employees and employers or the organization in their relationship, in their employment relationship. So basically, the arrows leading from the employees towards the organization expresses that for the employees, it's the expectation of the employer of the employees, or the ethical obligations of the employee to the organization would include for them not to engage in behaviors where there is conflict of interest, or they should also exercise some form of secrecy and confidentiality with regards to the information that they encounter in while executing their tasks within the organization. And it's expected also of employees that they should exercise a high level of honesty while working within organizations. And if you look also at the arrow leading from the organization towards the employee, is basically looking at what the ethical obligation should be like for the organization towards the employees. That means the expectations of the employees, the expectations by the employees of the organization. And this would include the terms of hiring and the firing. What are the working conditions like, right? Especially given that the expectation will be that the employer or organization offers the employee some form of job security, right? Also, the expectation would include that they are paid, and that a conducive working environment is provided for the employees. That's why you have the wages and working conditions, right? And it's also expected that whatever information or private identifiable information that is provided by the employee to the organization, that such information is kept private, and is ensured that such information is not divulged, and that there is some form of respect accorded to the employee by the employer or managers of the organization. Also, you will also see arrows leading down to where you have the economic agents, and that's trying to tell you exactly that there are some form of ethical obligations too that organizations owe to some stakeholders or external bodies that have some form of relationship or some form of interfacing with the organization. And you find out that such bodies or such stakeholders as well have some form of interactions with employees of an organization as well, and it's expected that these employees of the organization have ethical obligations towards these stakeholders or these economic agents that they interface with. As we discussed in the previous slide, using the diagram and information captured on that diagram, on managerial ethics, how an organization treats its employees would include what the policies or the procedures are or standards are with regards to their hiring and firing practices, right? What the wages are and working conditions are for employees of the organization. And with regards to employee privacy, we talked about the personal information provided by employees to the employer, how they protect such information to ensure that it is not such information is not divulged to the public, and some form of courtesy that is accorded employees of an organization by managers of the organization, right? So you find out that in Francis Marion University, so regarding hiring and firing, on the broader perspective, given the state of South Carolina, which is an employment at will state, you find out that the organization or organizations in South Carolina may not have much ethical obligation with regards to job security to their employees. and that has to do with policies regarding their hiring and their firing, meaning that in most cases, more often than not, most employers can easily fire their employees without reason because of the employment at will law that exists in South Carolina. In the same vein, employees of an organization can choose to cease working for an employer without providing them any notice, given the employment at will law that exists in South Carolina. And so also you have other elements of how an organization treats its employees, which we discussed earlier on. Looking at the second item on this slide, how employees treat the organization, we already discussed most of those, right? And that would be it for this discussion here. So basically, when we talk about conflict of interest, right, we talked about this occurs when a decision potentially benefits the individual to the possible detriment of the organization. So it's expected that such behaviors or whatever actions an employee would engage in that would basically be harmful to the organization but very, very profitable to the employer, that ethics or ethical it's ethically expected, or it's an ethical obligation of the employee not to engage in such behaviors, right? And so on and so forth, as contained in the slide. So it's expected also that with regards to honesty, that employees shouldn't falsify their resumes when they're seeking employment or when they're trying to get employment. They shouldn't provide false information with regards to their qualification or their job experiences or even their references, as the case may be, or while they are trying to get some time off on health grounds, that such should be approached from honest perspectives or honest grounds or honest backgrounds. So it wouldn't be like they are providing such, or they are calling off sick whereas they are not sick in reality. Further on the managerial ethics, the other item would be how other economic agents are treated, and this would include the customers of organizations, their competitors, their stockholders, suppliers, dealers, and whatever unions their employees belong to. But like I would say, in the state of South Carolina, it's the law does not allow for unionization, so you wouldn't find unions in Francis Marion University, as the case will be for our organization of interest. Now, it's expected that when an organization is providing some form of promotions or adverts for maybe their products or services and providing such adverts to customers, that they should be very honest or ethical in whatever information they are providing out there, right? And even in their financial disclosures, for example, when they are relaying information regarding the organizational performance to their stockholders, right, at the end of maybe the fiscal year, they should be able to disclose the finances of the organization responsibly and ethically, right, without having to falsify some figures on their financial statements. Also, in their ordering and purchasing, with regards to their relationship with their suppliers, it's expected that they should be ethical. Also, with the dealers, when they are chipping and doing some solicitations, right, chipping off their products or having to ship their services, be it through some form of licensing to some organizations, it's expected that in their relationship with those dealers, maybe even in a foreign location, right? For internationalized organizations, it's expected that they should be ethical, right? And in their relationship with unions with regards to collective bargaining for employees of the organization who are part of the unions, it's expected that they should be ethical in their negotiations as well. But like I told you, in the state of South Carolina, that wouldn't happen because a law exists that this allows for unionization within organizations. Now, looking at ethical responses, you find out that peer managers, top managers of the organizational culture all contribute to the ethical context of organizations, right? So whatever ethical responses that exist within organizations is an attribute of the peer managers that actually provide for those ethical behaviors or exercise those ethical behaviors, as well as the organizational culture that actually impacts or informs the behaviors of members of the organization. It also includes the personal standards of ethics. So, whatever individual within the organization that is faced with an ethical situation, it depends on what their personal standards are, and also managerial responses to unethical behavior. What are the consequences for unethical behavior? So, like in Francis Marion University, it must be captured, I believe, that in the student handbook you have consequences for unethical behavior or unacceptable behavior within the environment of Francis Marion University. So the enforcement of such punishments will definitely be managerial responses to unethical behavior within Francis Marion University, and those managerial responses actually try to re-emphasize what the ethical behavior or what the norms should be within an organization. Also, high levels of contribution contribute to the context for ethics, meaning that when organizations are faced with high level of competition, especially with their competitors or among competition existing with some dominant players in the industry in which they exist, you find out that organizations may be tempted to engage in unethical behaviors for them to get even or for them to remain profitable in the face of competition. So these are the contexts for managerial ethics within organizations. Managing ethical behavior, like we said in the earlier slide, when the student handbook contains policies or consequences for unethical behavior while in the Francis Marion University environment, when such consequences or punishments are enforced, it re-emphasizes what ethical behavior or what the norms are within the Francis Marion University. And you find out that in most cases, more often than not, what actually models the behavior or what models what is considered ethical behavior within the confines of an organization is basically what the body language of the leadership is, right? And that's why it says here on this slide that emphasizing ethical behavior takes many forms but starts with top management. So top management is the leadership, and this basically says what the leadership, their body language is like, is what actually permeates across the organization, and that's what propagates as ethical behaviors or the norms of the organization, or maybe the culture of the organization. So you find out that the leadership is usually part of what ensures that punishments for unethical behavior are meted out adequately when such happens within the organization. But when leadership or the top managers allow for such behaviors to go unpunished, then that will send signals that unethical behavior is basically acceptable within the organization. Now, there are three common options for managing ethical behavior. One would be creating ethical codes, and like I said, this would be written statements of the value of ethical standards that guide the firm's actions. Like I told you earlier on, these standards will be contained in the student handbook that is handed out to students upon entry into Francis Marion University. It's also contained in the faculty handbook that is available to members of faculty. So these handbooks actually have written statements on what the ethical standards are with, or what the norms are within Francis Marion University, and this guides the actions of Francis Marion University, especially regarding their actions in their relationship with their employees, as well as their relationship with the students who are their customers or economic agents. Also, you find out that another option for managing ethical behavior will be to apply moral judgment, meaning that there should be some form of justification for whatever actions that are taken by an organization, or maybe in their relationship with an employee, or maybe a customer. Maybe like in Francis Marion University, there should be some form of justification for whatever actions that may be meted out on faculty or staff or students who are economic agents, and vice versa as well for employees of Francis Marion University in their relationship with Francis Marion University. Also, there is the need, which is the third option, for maintenance of organizational justice, whereby there's consistency in enforcement or consistency in the process from one employee to another in the relationship between employees and employers. Or maybe there should be consistency in how an organization treats their economic agents. There should be some form of consistency that would relate to a maintenance of organizational justice, if that makes sense. So that will be it on managing ethical behavior on this slide. Further on managing ethical behavior, applying moral judgment. Like I said earlier in the previous slide, applying moral judgment has to do with having justifications, or managers within an organization having justifications for their actions, especially their actions in their relationship with employees of the organization or with economic agents of the organization, right? And in the ways they could have those justification for their actions, one of those ways would be to gather the relevant factual information that they need in their decision making in those interactions. Also, they would have to determine the most appropriate moral values in such situations, and they would have to make an ethical judgment based on the rightness or wrongness of the proposed action or policy that they're looking at implementing in such relationships. Other principles that may be adopted in managing ethical behavior within organizations would include having the ethical norms, like I told you, within organizations, right? So individuals have ethics, but organizations have the norms, and this would include, in having these ethical norms, you would have, in coming up with these ethical norms, you have to look at the utility of these norms. And by utility, we mean, does the act optimize action outcomes, or the results rather, right? So in having the norms in place, would it provide for the expected behavior or the acceptable behavior that is necessary within the organizational environment, right? And does it protect the right of all the stakeholders involved when such actions or when such norms are instituted within an organization? Is it considerate of all the stakeholders that would have some form of relationship with the organization, be it the employees of the organization or the economic agents of the organization? And also, would such norms be consistent and fair, meaning would it apply across every stakeholder, be it the employee, be it the customer, be it whoever that has some form of interaction with the organization? And also, is such norm caring, which means is the act consistent with people's responsibilities to each other? Still on managing ethical behavior, organizational justice. This has to do with how employees of an organization perceive fairness within the organization, and it comes in four basic forms. The first will be the distributive, you have the procedural, you have the interpersonal, and you have the informational. On organizational justice, the distributive justice has to do with employee perception of the fairness or organizational fairness with regards to distribution of their rewards. In Francis Marion University, for instance, this would have to do with what are the policies on performance rewards, right? And here in Francis Marion University, you find out that performance rewards in form of increments are given it's a flat rate across board whenever it's given. It's a flat percentage for all employees of Francis Marion University. That alludes to some form of fairness because it's the same across board, straight right from the president of the university to whichever employee that earns the least. They get the same percentage increments. So with regards to distributive justice, that will be seen as fair within Francis Marion University, right? And it has to do also with what are the policies for promotion, right? So within Francis Marion University, it has to do with what are the criteria for example, faculty eligibility to go to the next level in their career. For instance, as an assistant professor, what are the teaching, research, and service requirements within Francis Marion University for me as an assistant professor to get promoted to an associate professor? That would have to do with how consistently such policies are applied for all assistant professors within Francis Marion University. That would have to do with distributive justice, right? Also, when you talk about the policy on what the service awards that are given within, like the long service awards within Francis Marion University, how that is applicable across all members of staff or all members of faculty, as the case may be, when it is being handed out. That would have to relate to the distributive justice, right? Or maybe how are awards given for teaching excellence, or how are awards given, the criteria for giving out awards for maybe research excellence, and how that is given out, how employees perceive that to be fair within Francis Marion University has to do with the distributive justice. Procedural justice has to do with employee perception of organizational fairness when they are determining outcomes, right? It has to do with the process for determining outcomes, like maybe the process for promotion. Let's say the promotion exercise, right? The approach to promotion exercises, for instance, within an organization, will have to do with procedural fairness. Everybody that go up for promotion, for instance, within Francis Marion University, are they given the same level playing ground to ensure that is the criteria the same for promotion? For instance, what is the process for getting to the next level in their career? Is the process the same across schools, or does it differ across schools and specialties, or is the process the same basically holistically on the organizational perspective or lenses? That would have to do with procedural justice. And interpersonal justice has to do with employee perception of fairness, or how people see the fairness people see in how they are treated by others within organizations, right? That has to do with person to person relationship. So in a manager subordinate relationship, the courtesy that is accorded to the subordinate by the manager would relate to the interpersonal justice that is sensed by the subordinate of the manager. That is how that is seen with regards to interpersonal justice. That is just one example, and you can apply that to many other situations as well. And informational justice would have to do with employee specific fairness of information used for decision. So how is the information obtained? Is it basically considerate of all the stakeholders involved, or is it partial in is it selective in the information gathering? Is there due diligence in the information gathering? That would actually relate to the extent of informational justice that is accorded to employees, or that would inform the perception of employees regarding informational justice, or the fairness of information used for decisions within an organization. The diagram on this slide illustrates the guide for ethical decision making by managers of an organization. And you find out that for them to come up, or for managers to come up with a decision, or to engage in decision making, or institute a policy within an organization, they have to do their due diligence, which entails having to gather the facts regarding whatever policy or whatever decision they intend on taking or implementing, as the case may be. So when they gather the facts or all information or relevant information, they would now have to consider to what extent whatever decision they're about to take or whatever policy they're about to institute actually aligns with those four dimensions we discussed earlier on managing ethical behavior. When we discussed the ethical norms, they will basically look at how well the decision they're about to undertake, given the information they have at hand, how well such decision would ensure for the best outcomes, would ensure for optimized outcomes. That has to do with the utility criteria for actually analyzing the effectiveness of such decision or the effectiveness of such policy making, right? And another criteria for assessing the effectiveness of such decision by a manager or the policy that is about to be instituted would have to be the consideration of the rights of the stakeholders that will be impacted by that decision or by that policy. And you would have to the manager has to be considerate of whether such decision or policy would be respectful of the rights of the individuals that are involved or the stakeholders that are involved. So if it has to be a policy that would affect employees, would it be trampling on the rights of employees or not? That would be considered by the manager before having to make that decision, right? Another criteria would be the element of justice, right? Would such a decision be considered fair in the organization, or would such a policy be considered fair? That looks at the element of justice. Like we discussed, organizational justice is about the perception of fairness with regards to whatever decisions managers take or whatever policies that are existent within an organization. And also the other criteria for making decisions, or that should be considered for making when managers make decisions or are about to institute a policy, would be how caring such a decision will be. And by caring, the manager will be considerate of the fact whether the decision is consistent with the manager's responsibility to care or to be caring towards whatever stakeholder that decision is impacting, be it the employee or the economic agent like the customer, right? So such a decision, would it be consistent with the manager's position to be very caring in such a relationship? That would all be guiding for a decision to be made by a manager or for a policy to be instituted within an organization. And you can see from the diagram that if it is no on all these four criteria, then the act or policy or the decision or policy is not ethical. And if it is no on 1, 2, or 3 criteria, then the manager has to look deeper to check if there are overriding factors, whether one criterion rather is more important than the rest of the criteria that it's no on, and if there are any debilitating factors that make for the no on all other criteria, and if it could pass the double effect test. So when it's no on all of these items, then such a decision or policy may be considered unethical. But when it is yes on all these items, when it is yes, then it would be that the decision or policy may be considered ethical. Now, also along these 4 criteria, when it's yes on all these criteria, then such managerial decision or policy that is intended to be implemented within the organization will be considered ethical. Ethical leadership. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 requires CEOs and CFOs to vouch for the truthfulness and fairness of their organization's financial disclosures or their organization's financial statements. You find out that leaders set the ethical tone for the organization, and there are significant penalties for violations of this Sarbanes-Oxley Act when leaders cook the books. When I mean cook the books, it means manipulate the figures that are contained in their financial statements. And you find out that when leaders engage in such dishonesty, such practices will permeate the organization, setting the tone for unethical behaviors further down the hierarchy within such an organization. Corporate governance. Corporate governance has to do with the fact that there are ethical issues with the corporate governance of organizations in recent times, right? And basically, when for ethical leadership with regards to corporate governance, it has to do with provision of adequate corporate governance, whereby board of directors of organizations must be independent and void of any influence of the bureaucracy of the organization. And as well, it's expected that the board of directors of organizations should be familiarized with the industry, of quite knowledgeable in the industry of the organization's operations. Also, such ethical standard or ethical leadership with regards to corporate governance ensures that the interest of shareholders of the organization are protected, as well as that there's proper management of the organization with regards to decision making. Also, you find out that in recent times, like I said, why there's been some form of emphasis or some form of wide or broader concerns or broader focus on corporate governance is because there have been issues with bribery charges, right? Whereby board members have been seen to be implicated in charges whereby CEOs are paid high bonuses even if organizations did not perform highly, right? Even if organizations were not quite profitable, but CEOs were paid bonuses on the basis that the organizations were profitable. So those are ethical concerns that have been raised with regards to corporate governance in organizations. Further on ethical leadership, information technology, you find out that there is the need for organizations to protect the online privacy for their employees as well as their customers, right? So in Francis Marion University, for instance, you find out that for access, for access to information, to private information regarding employees of Francis Marion University, be it faculty or staff, you find out that there's some form of login details that is given out to such employee that is unique to such employee, right? That has the username and the original password, which they can always modify, right, for security purposes, right? So that is to protect their online privacy, as well as students who are customers of Francis Marion University. You find out that students have unique login details that they use for access to whatever their personal information is, or personal details regarding their academics here in Francis Marion University, academic pursuits. So these are all measures that are related to ethical leadership of Francis Marion University in ensuring that there is some form of online privacy of the information of both their employees and their customers who are their students. Now, looking at the balance with regards to information technology, balance between individual rights and corporate rights, right? You find out that for corporate rights, it's an unethical behavior to use organizations' IT equipment and infrastructure for personal use. Now, that is to tell you that in Francis Marion University, especially for members of faculty and staff, any IT equipment that is made available to them by virtue of their employment with Francis Marion University, it's expected that unethical behavior would be when they utilize such IT equipment for their personal use that isn't official or related to the business of Francis Marion University, right? Now, still on information technology, there's the potential for abuse of information technology by individuals, right? And in order to check that, another ethical leadership approach that could be undertaken by organizations would be to establish IT policies that check abuse, right? And the signing of IT compliance for new hires, right? So this used to happen in the organization I worked for, whereby new hires have to sign an IT compliance form or IT compliance agreement. And also another way where such potential for abuse could be checked. Another approach to that would be blocking access to social media platforms, because people could utilize maybe the internet infrastructure of organizations to actually go on social media pages, and such access in some organizations are blocked so that it actually does not is not abused, right? Another way you can ensure, or organizations can ensure or actually approach ethical leadership with information technology within their environment is to gather data on the searches on the infrastructure of the organization, what the keystrokes and the amount of time that employees spend on certain websites of the organization. That way they can actually be ethical in their leadership with regards to information technology, right? So it's not expected that ethically that people should use the company technology for personal use. And also it brings to question who owns the data. When it comes to ethics, it brings to question who owns the data that is provided, or maybe let's say data that is produced by an employee of an organization. Is that data owned by the employee who produced that information, or is it owned by the employer who was paying the employee and whose equipment the employee was utilizing while producing such information? Areas of social responsibility. Social responsibility has to do with corporate obligations of an organization to the community in which they operate, or the environment in which they operate, for peaceful coexistence and favorable outcomes. So you can say it's a set of obligations an organization has to protect and enhance the societal context in which they function. And under social responsibility, there are areas or people to whom, or elements of social responsibility, and that would include the stakeholder. Stakeholder would basically be the person or organization that is affected by the practices of an organization, or that has some form of interest in the performance, or has some form of stake with regards to the performance of the organization, right? So you find out that most organizations concentrate on three main groups of stakeholders, and that would include their customers, because they are affected by the products or services of the organization, their employees, because they are contributors towards ensuring the delivery of products and services of the organization, as well as the investors or shareholders or stockholders of the organization. These are basically the main groups of stakeholders that are considered by organization. Now you find out that you also have the other element of social responsibility, which is the natural environment, which is the environment that affects the operation, what elements of the environment that are impacted or that affect the operations of the organization, for which the organization has some obligation to. Now you talk about waste management, so organizations that actually produce waste, with regards to the environment in which they operate, it is expected that such pollutions that may be caused by the disposal of those organizational waste should be managed, right? It's expected that organizations are obligated to ensure the adequate or very healthy disposal of whatever waste that are produced by such organizations, in order not to pollute the environment in which they operate, for peaceful coexistence, right? Also, you have the element of climate change, which is an attribute of the natural environment in which organizations operate, right, affecting the operations, and organizations are obligated to ensure that whatever that products or services they offer aren't impacting the weather conditions of the environment in which they operate. So for organizations, for instance, that are maybe in the oil and gas industry, right, it's expected that the environment in which they operate, that they do not pollute that environment, or that they do not cause for climate change, let's say for maybe global warming when they are flaring gas, right, that they do not provide for that when or pollute the environment with regards to their operations. Now you have the disastrous environmental accidents, and the disastrous environmental accidents might have to do with the oil and gas as well when there are oil spills in the environment in which they operate, right? So you find out that also that such organizations, oil and gas organizations, would be obligated to do some form of very, very responsive and quick or speedy cleaning of such spills or of such accidents that are disastrous in the environment in which they operate. Another arm of social responsibility of organizations will be the general social welfare, and this has to do with the promotion of general welfare of the society, and it may be the society in which they are operational, or maybe an extended society whereby their goods and services are actually sold. They may not be physically present there, but by virtue of having business interests in that society, they may engage in the organizations may engage in the general social welfare of such organizations, and that has to do with maybe giving out to charity and so for and so on. So it says organizations can promote the general social welfare by contributing to charities, philanthropic organizations, and not-for-profit foundations and associations. Organizational stakeholders. Like relayed in the previous slide, you find out that most companies concentrate on the three main groups of stakeholders, which include the customers, the employees, and the investors, or who you may call the shareholders, right? But this diagram on this slide gives an elaborate illustration of other stakeholders, which include both the three main groups of stakeholders, in addition to other stakeholders an organization may have. Furthering our thoughts on the natural environment element of social responsibility, you'll see that it'll be observed that countries, states, and counties now have laws in place or regulations that actually prescribe for how businesses treat their environments of operations. Also, such regulations prescribed for how these organizations will go about disposing their hazardous waste in order not to pollute this environment. They will prescribe for how their operations that affect weather conditions should be approached in order to allow for sustainability of the environments that they operate in. But in as much as these laws have been put in place, you find out that they are not all encompassing. So much more has to be done with regards to ensuring that organizations are socially responsible with regards to preserving the natural environment of their operations. Now, on general social welfare, we already discussed that organizations in relation to social responsibility may contribute to charities, philanthropic organizations, as well as other organizations. There are arguments for and against whether organizations should be socially responsible to their environments of operation, or even beyond their environments of operation. And on this diagram illustrated on this slide, you find out that to your left, there are arguments for organizations being socially responsible, whereas to your right, you have arguments against social responsibility of organizations. Approaches to social responsibility. Obstructionist stance. Organizations that assume the obstructionist stance do as little as possible with regards to social responsibility. And this obstructionist stance basically describes organizations who do as little as possible in the social responsibility arena. And when they are cited for unethical behavior, these such organizations deny it, cover it up, or try to hide it. Defensive stance. The organization who assumes this stance does only what is legally required by maybe the country of its operation, the state of its operation, or the county of its operation, and they don't engage in any more areas of social responsibility besides what is legally required of them. And that may include installation of equipment, but not more expensive equipment that is better. So for instance, if it is legally required that as their social responsibility and equipment should be installed, they go for the basic form of equipment rather than going for that will serve that will serve for the better good of people who will utilize such equipment. Accommodative stance. This would be organizations trying to meet the basic legal requirements, and sometimes such organizations may go beyond what is legally required of them rather than staying with the defensive stance, right? In the accommodative stance, they basically meet the what is legally required of them with regards to social responsibility, but could do a bit more. And that would include when organizations donate to community groups, right? That would be an accommodative stance when they donate to some groups that are existing in their environment of operations. And you have the proactive stance whereby organization views itself as a citizen in its environment of operation and seeks opportunities to actually contribute towards the development of such environment in which they operate. Still on approaches to social responsibility. On this diagram that is relaying a spectrum for the degree of social responsibility that may be adopted or assumed by organizations, you find out that on the spectrum it goes from the left to the right of the spectrum, which is indicative of the lowest approaches or the lowest degree of social responsibility of organizations, which is the obstructionist stance, up to the highest, which is to the right, which is the proactive stance, whereby organizations assume themselves to be citizens of the environment in which they operate and do a lot more. How business and government influence each other with regards to social responsibility. The government influence of business actually comes in forms of laws, regulations, and acts that protect the environment in which organizations operate, that protects the consumers that actually avail themselves of the goods and services of organizations, that protect the employees that work for organizations, as well as protect the investment of shareholders or securities of those organizations. Also, it may also influence businesses. Government may influence businesses via the taxes that they impose on these businesses, given the profitability of these businesses. On the other hand, businesses influence government in forms of the personal contacts that these organizations have with people or government personnel, and also in forms of lobbying that they lobby the legislature to come up with maybe laws or to come up with regulations or acts that are in favor of the businesses or these organizations, and also through political action committees or other influence tactics. How government influences organizations through direct regulation. And this has to do with putting in place laws regulations, rules that dictate what organizations can do and what they cannot do. And such laws, most often than not, comes up from what the societal beliefs are about what businesses should do and what they should not be allowed to do. Also, you have true indirect regulation, and the indirect regulation has to do with ways that government seeks to influence organizations to act in a socially responsible manner without utilizing the direct laws or direct regulations. And one way government does that is to change the tax structure of organizations to make business act in a way that the government thinks is socially acceptable. And by that, what I mean is that you find out that the government could give organizations tax incentives or what you call tax cuts. And those tax cuts is basically to encourage businesses to invest more in the environments in which they operate, maybe to invest in infrastructural developments of the environments in which they operate, given the tax cuts or tax incentives that are given to them by government, so they can be partners in infrastructural development with the government, given the tax breaks or tax cuts. How organizations influence government. Personal contacts. The relationships that are established between business leaders and political leaders can be effective for businesses to present their cases or positions to government officials. And that is why personal contacts could be utilized in the influence of organizations on the government. Lobbying. Lobbying uses persons or groups of persons to formally represent an organization before political bodies like the legislature. The Political Action Committee is created to solicit and distribute money to political candidates by organizations. So when these political candidates are successfully elected, especially for instance to the legislature, they can come up with regulations or laws that protect the interest of these organizations that actually distributed money towards their elections. Favors and other influence tactics. You find out that organizations rely on favors and other influence tactics to gain support, and such favors vary widely, such as offering free airline travel on corporate jets, conferences for these government officials, workshops that are fully sponsored by these organizations for these government officials, or even taking up paying some of their bills, right, as part of granting favors to influence the decisions of these government officials with regards to these organizations' operations. Formal organizational actions, legal compliance. This refers to the extent to which an organization complies with local, state, federal, and international laws. However, an organization being conformant or compliant with extant laws does not guarantee ethical behaviors of the organization. Now, ethical compliance, this would be the extent to which the organization and its members or employees follow basic ethical standards of behavior. And for ethical compliance to be achieved, you find out that there should be an establishment of formal ethics committee to evaluate current practices, right? To see how well current practices serve the need for ethical behavior, or the need for, or align with the ethical norms of the organizational environment, right? And also, these formal ethics committees would also be charged with enforcing compliance or enforcing consequences or punishments where there is the situation of non-compliance or situations of unethical behavior within an organization, or with regards to an organization exercising their social responsibility. Philanthropic giving. This has to do with the awarding of funds or other gifts to charities or other social programs. Informal organizational actions. Organizational leadership and culture. You find out that these aspects of the organization, the leadership and its culture, define the social responsibility posture of an organization. The body language of the leadership of an organization basically sets the tone for social responsibility in the entire organization. Whistleblowing. This has to do with the disclosure by an employee of illegal or unethical conducts on the part of others within the organization. How an organization often responds to such disclosures by an employee indicates its stance on social responsibility or its stance on ethical behaviors within that organization. The first report behavior to the boss, then up the chain of command if nothing is done. So in establishments, it's expected that for escalation of unethical behavior, right, for reporting unethical behavior, the first point of call will be to report such unethical behaviors to the first line managers. And when such first line managers do not effectively handle such reports, then it could be escalated maybe to middle managers, and further up, when such middle managers do not fully address such reports or report of unethical behavior, then it can be further escalated to the top managers, for which if nothing eventually is done with regards to such unethical behaviors that have been expressed within the organization, then it informs on the culture of the organization about that unethical behaviors are of that kind are acceptable within such an organization. Evaluating social responsibility. For an organization to evaluate its social performance, it may conduct a corporate social audit. And this is basically a formal and thorough analysis of the effectiveness of the organization's social performance. Such audit is conducted by a task force of high level managers from within the organization. And what they do is they define what the social goals are, analyze what resources should be allocated to the attainment of each goal, and determine how well the organization is actually progressing towards achieving each of the goals they set out to achieve. Furthermore, such an audit makes recommendations about the areas that require improvement or that require modification with regards to the goals that have been set to achieve.